The cabin had always been my quiet escape, a place tucked far enough from the city to feel like a world of its own. It sat at the edge of a private shoreline, a strip of sand my grandfather purchased decades earlier when the whole area was little more than forgotten land. Over the years, development crept closer, new houses rose, and with them came the inevitable presence of an HOA determined to manage everything within reach. They operated like silent watchmen, convinced they controlled every inch of the region, except they didn't. The cabin and the beach had never belonged to them, and the property line documents proved it. But the HOA had never bothered to check. They simply assumed control was theirs. For months, I had stayed away from the cabin due to work and travel, leaving the shoreline untouched and the cabin quietly aging. When I returned with plans for restoration, I expected a peaceful weekend, one filled with sweeping out old dust, clearing branches, and soaking in the quiet rhythm of waves. I didn't expect the eyes watching, judging, and plotting from houses that now dotted the hill above the shore. The first sign of trouble came when unfamiliar vehicles slowly crept by, their drivers pretending to check GPS directions while their gazes lingered too long on the cabin. Even from inside, it felt like being inspected. It wasn't long before neighbors emerged, each with the stiff posture of people guarding rules they believed were absolute. They moved with purpose, pointing at the cabin, at the private beach, at me, like I was already on their list of violations. The HOA president, a woman known in whispered local stories as the type who enforced rules no one agreed to, had been waiting for someone to challenge her system. The cabin's sudden activity must have triggered a personal alarm. She arrived armed with a clipboard, a camera, and the confidence of someone who believed the land under her feet bowed to her authority. Although she never approached me directly, the way she filmed the cabin from the road gave away her intentions. She was gathering evidence, compiling assumptions, and preparing to bury me under HOA rules that had nothing to do with my property. I continued working, ignoring their stares, sweeping the deck and clearing driftwood from the sand. The beach was quiet, untouched, and exactly how my grandfather left it. Every wave reminded me why this place mattered. The HOA saw only a potential violation, I saw memories, history, and rightful ownership. Yet the more I worked, the more restless the HOA became. It was as if the idea of someone restoring property they didn't control personally insulted them. Their restlessness grew into boldness. Before the first day even ended, a group of board members marched down the path toward the shoreline, not onto my land, but close enough to make a point. They took notes, exchanged disapproving glances, and spoke loudly enough for their discontent to drift to my ears. They discussed fines, restrictions, and compliance, all without verifying whether the cabin was under their jurisdiction. Their confidence came from assumption, not fact. When I stepped out with bags of old trash to load into my truck, the HOA president snapped more photos as if capturing evidence of wrongdoing. Her certainty was almost humorous. She genuinely believed she had authority over the cabin, the beach, and me. That belief became the spark that pushed the situation from mild annoyance to outright confrontation. By the next morning, the tension had thickened enough to be felt in the air. Vehicles slowed down even more. People whispered behind hedges. Cameras peeked from curtains. The HOA president passed by repeatedly, pacing near the cabin like a guard protecting forbidden territory. She did not like that the beach was being cleaned. She especially did not like that I, someone she had not approved, was the one doing it. When I began restoring the old fire pit area, that was the final straw for her. She must have decided I was violating some imagined rule, damaging community property, or trespassing on land she thought she controlled. What she did next revealed just how far she was willing to go. Without speaking to me, without verifying ownership, and without even a moment of rational thought, she escalated the situation in the most dramatic way possible. She contacted local law enforcement and reported suspicious activity at what she claimed was HOA-controlled beachfront property. She told them an unknown man had taken over the cabin, altered the beach, and might be damaging HOA assets. She described it like an emergency, something demanding immediate response. I was unaware of this brewing storm as I continued clearing driftwood and raking the sand. The shore was peaceful, broken only by distant gull calls and the soft crash of waves. It was the perfect moment of calm before the chaos. Then the sound of multiple engines broke the silence. Gravel crunched. Doors slammed. A wave of tension rippled through the hill as neighbors stepped outside, eager to watch the show they believed the HOA president had orchestrated perfectly. They expected someone to be dragged away, scolded, or fined. They expected the HOA to win. Four officers walked down the path with purpose, their expressions firm and professional. Their presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. This was no casual questioning, they had been told something serious was happening. The HOA president followed them triumphantly, already imagining the scene unfolding exactly as she planned. She believed she finally had enough power to prove she owned every decision made around the cabin. From where I stood on the sand, the sight looked almost surreal. Police, neighbors, HOA members, all converging because someone cleaned their own private beach. The HOA president gestured dramatically at the cabin and pointed at me as if declaring victory before anything had even started. But as the officers approached, something subtle changed. The lead officer examined the shoreline, the cabin, the property markers barely visible from years of neglect. His expression shifted slightly, like a puzzle piece had clicked into place. The HOA president noticed his hesitation. She doubled down, trying to reassert the confidence she arrived with. But the officer wasn't responding the way she expected. Instead, he paused, studying the land with a new understanding. Something wasn't adding up for him, and he knew it. The HOA president, however, was so sure she was right that she didn't see the shift happening. She didn't realize the very thing she feared, the truth, was only moments from surfacing. And as the officers prepared to speak, the atmosphere changed again, heavier now, ready to crack open a revelation that would flip the entire situation upside down. A revelation the HOA was absolutely unprepared for. The officers stood at the edge of the sand, assessing the scene with growing uncertainty. Their arrival had been fueled by the HOA's dramatic report, yet what they found didn't fit the description at all. There was no chaos, no damage, no suspicious activity, just a man quietly restoring an aging cabin and clearing a neglected shoreline. Even before they said anything, it was clear they sensed they'd been pulled into something unnecessary. Still, they followed procedure. They approached calmly, surveying the land, checking the path behind them, and mentally piecing together the details of the call. The HOA president hovered just a step behind them, eager to witness the moment she believed would validate all her assumptions. She carried herself like someone who had already won, someone convinced the officers would only exist to enforce her will. But as the lead officer stopped near the old boundary post that had stood on the property since my grandfather's time, his posture changed. He studied the weathered marker, then glanced toward the cabin, then toward the shore. He wasn't looking for violations, he was checking something much more foundational. His eyes followed a line in the sand that only someone trained would immediately recognize, the subtle but unmistakable signs of a property boundary. The HOA president noticed his focus drifting away from her narrative. She stepped forward, trying to regain control, pointing again at the cabin as if repeating her accusations would make them true. Her voice carried the tone of someone convinced authority belonged to her alone, and that the officers were simply tools to execute her decision, but the officers weren't reacting the way she expected. Their interest was no longer on her claims. They were studying the land itself, searching for confirmation of a suspicion forming quietly in their minds. Meanwhile, neighbors gathered along the upper path, some leaning on fences, others sipping coffee as if attending an outdoor performance. They whispered eagerly, waiting for drama that might validate their HOA's sense of power. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to anticipation, feeding off the tension that had spread across the beach. As I stood calmly on my shoreline, I could sense the shift more clearly than anyone. The officers were realizing the call didn't match the reality. They were recognizing that the HOA might have acted without understanding the truth. They were beginning to question everything they had been told. The lead officer finally requested identification, not in an accusatory manner, but in a standard, professional way. When I handed over the documents, his eyes immediately drifted to the property description. Something clicked for him. His expression sharpened with recognition as he looked from the paperwork to the land around him, mentally tracing the boundaries mentioned in the deed. The HOA president's confident posture began to stiffen. She tried to interject, attempting to dictate the situation, insisting the cabin and beach were under her jurisdiction, claiming rules were being broken, and demanding immediate action. But her words were losing their impact. The officers were no longer listening with full belief. They were listening with caution, wary now of the possibility that they'd been misled. When the lead officer handed the documents to another officer for verification, the HOA president grew visibly agitated. She pressed forward again, adding more accusations, describing imagined violations, insisting she had records proving ownership, yet none of those records were present. She hadn't brought any documents. She had only brought certainty. And her certainty was beginning to crack. The second officer returned with a subtle nod, confirming what the lead officer already suspected. The deed was valid. The cabin was privately owned. The beach was not HOA property. And the HOA president had made the call without verifying even the simplest detail. The realization settled over the group like a sudden shadow. For the officers, it was a moment of clarity. Their stance softened, and their attention shifted from investigation to resolution. For the neighbors watching from above, it was a moment of confusion. Whispers turned into puzzled glances as they tried to understand why the officer's demeanor had changed. But for the HOA president, it was an unraveling. Her face tightened. She expected compliance, control, and authority. Instead, she was confronted with a truth she had never even considered: the land she believed she controlled was never under HOA jurisdiction at all. The lead officer, now fully aware of the situation, turned his attention back toward me. His tone was professional, lighter than before, carrying no sense of suspicion, only acknowledgement of lawful ownership. Meanwhile, the HOA president's posture shifted from triumph to disbelief, her confidence draining quickly as the officers subtly distanced themselves from her narrative. Neighbors leaned in, hoping to catch any sign of what was happening. Their cameras lifted. Their expressions twisted with curiosity. They expected confrontation, but what they got instead was the unraveling of the HOA's authority, and the beginning of an embarrassment none of them had predicted. When the officer gestured toward the property markers and pointed out the boundary clearly listed in the deed, the HOA president froze. It was a moment she hadn't prepared for, one she didn't know how to navigate. She attempted to regain control by insisting that the markers must be wrong, that the land survey must be outdated, that the HOA maps showed something entirely different. But without evidence, her claims fell flat. The officers remained firm. The documents were legitimate. The boundaries were clear. The cabin and the entire stretch of sand, every inch the HOA president tried to claim, belonged solely to me. The president's composure crumbled further. She tried to assert authority, but it no longer held weight. The officers maintained professionalism, but the undertone was unmistakable: the HOA had overstepped. Her assumptions had triggered an unnecessary police response, wasted time, and caused public embarrassment for the organization she was supposed to lead with responsibility. The neighbors realized it too. Their whispers turned into surprised murmurs. Some stepped back, suddenly uncomfortable being witnesses to their HOA's mistake. Others exchanged glances of disbelief, trying to understand how the president had gotten it so wrong. The tension thickened, not from conflict, but from the uncomfortable silence of a plan falling apart. The HOA president's face reddened, her earlier confidence replaced with an expression that hovered somewhere between shock and defiance. She had expected applause from her board members and validation from the officers. Instead, she found herself standing alone in a scene she had created through arrogance and assumption. The lead officer gave a final, definitive statement about the property status, making it clear that no laws had been broken, no HOA rules applied, and no further action was necessary. His professionalism never wavered, but there was a subtle tone of finality, one that signaled the matter was conclusively settled. The president, however, wasn't ready to accept defeat. She stepped closer to the officers, insisting the HOA would review the documents, challenge the ownership, and take whatever steps needed to reclaim what she still believed was theirs. But her words lacked conviction. She sounded desperate, clinging to authority already slipping from her hands. The officers remained unfazed. The law was on my side. The property was mine. And the HOA had reached the end of its influence. As the officers prepared to leave, a new tension began to rise, one not of conflict, but of the shift in power that the HOA president had never anticipated. The neighbors dispersed slowly, processing what they had witnessed, while the HOA president lingered, her mind racing to find a way to salvage her authority. But she didn't realize yet that things were about to get far worse for her. Because Chapter 3 would reveal a consequence she never saw coming, one that would shake the HOA far more than this embarrassing moment. The officer's departure should have marked the end of the confrontation, but for the HOA president, it was only the beginning of a downfall she never imagined. The moment the cruisers rolled away and the sound of engines faded, she remained frozen at the edge of the sand, staring at the property markers the officers had pointed out. It was as though reality had cracked open in front of her, forcing her to confront a truth she had spent years ignoring. Her authority had limits, and she had just slammed into them, publicly. I went back to restoring the shoreline, not out of pettiness, but because it needed to be done. The sand held years of driftwood and debris, and the cabin's exterior was overdue for repairs. But every movement I made, every rake pulled across the sand, seemed to echo louder in the HOA president's ears. She hovered near the path, watching with a mixture of disbelief and simmering frustration, unable to grasp that she had no jurisdiction over my work. Eventually she retreated, gathering her board members like a general regrouping after a lost battle. They whispered, gestured, and exchanged looks that revealed more panic than planning. Their perfect image, an HOA always in control, had taken a hit. And the neighbors who witnessed the incident were already walking back to their homes, ready to tell stories. Stories that didn't favor the HOA. Over the next 24 hours, the HOA attempted to recover its shattered authority. They sent emails to the neighborhood claiming the incident had been a miscommunication, insisting they had acted responsibly, and implying the police had merely been performing a routine check. But the neighbors weren't buying it. They had watched the officers' confused expressions, the property documents in hand, and the silent moment when the HOA president realized she was wrong. The truth spread faster than any official message. The incident became the neighborhood's new headline, overshadowing every minor complaint the HOA had ever enforced. Everyone knew the president had been humiliated, and worse, that she had called the police on a property she didn't control. When she showed her face the next morning, her usual confident stride had been replaced by careful, measured steps. Her board members tried to act unfazed, but whispers followed them everywhere. Homeowners who had once feared the HOA's strictness now saw the cracks in its authority. And like all organizations built on control rather than fairness, once people saw the cracks, the entire structure weakened. While the neighborhood buzzed with gossip, I continued restoring the cabin. Each improvement washed away years of neglect: fresh boards on the deck, cleaned windows, cleared pathways. The beach looked brighter too, the sand clean and smooth. But the more the property improved, the worse it seemed to make the HOA feel. They watched from afar, helpless, unable to enforce anything on land that legally had nothing to do with them. Eventually, the HOA president made her next move. She arrived with a folder stuffed with documents, her expression stiff as she marched down to the boundary line. She didn't cross it, she knew better now, but she stood close enough to make her intentions clear. She announced loudly enough for neighbors to overhear that the HOA would conduct a formal boundary review, hire a surveyor, and prove the beach was part of their community. But her confidence once again exceeded her evidence. Because she didn't know what I had in store. While the board planned their boundary fight, I contacted the county records office, the land surveyor who completed the most recent survey, and even pulled old maps archived decades earlier. My grandfather's purchase wasn't just legitimate, it was one of the oldest recorded private purchases along that shoreline. His deed wasn't vague. It was backed by physical markers, updated surveys, and clear jurisdictional lines. When the HOA's hired surveyor arrived weeks later, the president watched from a distance like a hawk waiting for prey. But the results were even worse for her than the police incident. The surveyor confirmed everything the officers already knew, the property line stood exactly where it always had. The beach belonged to me entirely, and the HOA's boundaries stopped 50 feet short, far above the shoreline they had been trying to control. The president's face lost its confidence the moment she heard the confirmation. Her board members looked equally defeated. They had spent HOA funds on a survey that proved them wrong. They had wasted time, embarrassed the neighborhood, and exposed their own lack of due diligence. But the consequences didn't end there. Homeowners who had once supported the HOA's strict enforcement now demanded accountability. They questioned why the HOA had spent community money on an unnecessary investigation. They questioned why police had been involved at all. They questioned how many other decisions the HOA had made without proper research. The HOA president tried to defend herself, but her arguments were thin, scattered, and fueled more by pride than logic. She insisted she acted in the community's best interest, yet the community no longer believed her. They wanted transparency. They wanted leadership. They wanted responsibility. And eventually, they asked for something bigger. They called for a vote to remove her. The day the vote took place, neighbors gathered at the clubhouse, their conversations pulsing with frustration and disappointment. The president sat rigidly at the front, surrounded by stacks of papers she believed would justify her actions. But most people weren't interested in excuses, they wanted change. The vote was swift. She was removed from her position by a wide margin. The HOA board, shaken by the backlash, issued an apology to the neighborhood and announced reforms to prevent similar incidents. They pledged clearer communication, better research, and a commitment to avoid overstepping boundaries, literal and figurative. They even sent a formal apology letter to me, acknowledging the mistake and assuring no future interference with the cabin or the private beach. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt lighter. The tension the HOA had created began to dissolve, replaced with a sense of relief. People stopped peering through curtains and began greeting each other openly again. The atmosphere shifted from surveillance to normalcy. As for the cabin, it transformed from a source of conflict into a restored sanctuary. The repairs were nearly complete, the shoreline clean and peaceful again. The sound of waves returned as the dominant presence, no officers, no HOA confrontations, no panicked whispers from neighbors. One quiet afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the water, I stood at the edge of the sand, feeling the breeze come off the waves. Everything that had happened, the police call, the confrontation, the HOA's collapse, seemed almost surreal. But the land beneath my feet grounded the moment. My grandfather's beach. My cabin. My shoreline. What had started as an attempt by the HOA to control something they never owned ended as a reminder that confidence without truth is fragile. And the moment truth finally arrives, it doesn't just reveal mistakes, it reshapes everything. The neighborhood changed. The HOA changed. Even the beach changed, returning to its quiet, rightful state. But the greatest change was in the people who once believed authority was unquestionable. They learned that boundaries matter, not just on land, but in power. The cabin stood as proof of that. And the beach, my beach, remained the place where the HOA's arrogance finally met reality.